You are listening to the Kelly Confidential Show with Kelly Wilkes. This is episode 16. Welcome to the Kelly Confidential Show, where we talk negotiation essentials and those crucial conversations empowering extraordinary women. Real women, real issues. Let's jump in. Hey guys, Kelly here. Hope you've all had a good week. It is Friday. And just before we tuck in, I always forget to mention these things. I wanted to share with you that I've got 2 courses coming out in the next 3 weeks. One is a mainstream release of my Negotiation for Mediators course, which is based on the same program I developed for the CMC Mediation Accreditation Program. That was run for the past 3 summers at Oxford with M&D Associates. That's the program that I just wrapped up last month. So I have a mainstream release of that course coming out. And the other I'm super excited about is a program called Negotiation Essentials for Women. I ran a pilot for this a year ago with a test group in Malta, and it had great feedback. And I've been developing it out, and it's ready to go. So yes, keep your ears to the ground as I'll be sharing the sign-up details about that next week. Right, let's tuck in. When I was a kid, my first ever job was working at a frozen yogurt shop called Penguins, located in the suburbs of Denver. And I absolutely loved it. Cute black and white uniforms. We could wear shorts and sneakers to work as long as they were black or white. Customers were always happy to see us. I mean, who goes into a frozen yogurt place grumpy? And the perks were, well, you can imagine. I swear I ate my weight in yogurt samples each week. And my manager, Sharon, was super. She was the best boss a kid could work for. And importantly, as I was only 15 at the time, she made sure I didn't work more than 5 hours on a school day and a 7.5-hour shift on the weekend, which usually worked out to, altogether, it was like 2 weekday shifts after school and then a Saturday shift on the weekend. And it was in keeping with the Colorado child labor laws, which specify the maximum per day and time of day hours a juvenile can legally work. So why was I working at 15? Well, in Colorado, you can work from the age of 15. If you have a work permit, which I promptly applied for and was granted when I turned 15. And the reason was I was saving for my car insurance. As in the state of Colorado, you can drive legally at 16 once you pass your driving test. Notice I didn't say drive well. But yes, I had a goal and I needed to be saving money. And I worked there for a year and a half. I worked my way up to assistant manager and then went on to another job after that. I think it was at a movie theater or maybe the Gap because they were paying more. Anyway, I remember it being fun, but also really hard work just because it made getting homework done tricky. And I ended up doing a lot of my homework while I was still at school on my lunch break, knowing that I'd be too tired to do it after getting home, later that night. All in all, though, it was a great introduction to the workforce, and I was lucky. I had a great boss who looked after her staff. All of us were teenagers, and she rewarded me for my hard work by giving me extra responsibilities and by making me a assistant manager and paying a fair wage. It was a great first life lesson about working, and I was really fortunate. But many, many are not as fortunate. It was last month when I first came across an article shared on LinkedIn that followed an investigative report from the New York Times about the truly terrible accounts of young migrants, mostly from South America, who had gone to the U.S. unaccompanied in most cases under desperate economic hardship to find a better life and to earn some money really to send back to their families. For context, when I say young, the ages recorded in this expose were primarily 12 to 15 years old. So roughly my age and younger from when I started out in the yogurt shop. The article by journalist Hannah Dreier presented one of several investigative pieces into the enormous scale of trafficked and enslaved young people across America. Over a period of 4 months, February through May this year, the New York Times dedicated continuous segments unpacking the reality of life for these young people. In one piece, Hannah writes, "The workers are part of a new economy of exploitation. Shadow workforce of migrant children, alone without their parents, connected to dodgy sponsors," it's my term, not hers, "lost in the system without paperwork." She goes on to say, "This shadow workforce extends across industries in every state, flouting child labor laws that have been in operation for nearly a century." She adds that she met 12-year-old roofers in Florida and Tennessee, underage slaughterhouse workers in Delaware, Mississippi, and North Carolina, children sawing planks of wood in overnight lumberyard shifts in South Dakota. In Michigan, children were reported working a high-speed conveyor belt, stuffing bags of Cheerios into passing yellow cereal cartons. And this was in a place where the conveyor belt was considered such dangerous work, where one woman lost some fingers being too close to the pulleys, and another had part of her scalp ripped off. So really gruesome. And at other major factories, like at Hearthside Foods, maker of the famous Nature Valley granola bars, Lucky Charms, and Cheetos, underage children tend giant ovens to prepare well-loved foods for shipment across North America. In another story, 6th graders, girls, cleaning hotel rooms were on their own in Virginia. 9th graders were working 14-hour overnight shifts in sawmills in South Dakota. All of these young people, children, interviewed were migrants, all exploited because they're not properly supported when they enter the country, have no legitimate sponsors, and most significantly, companies, large and small, are purposefully roping them into these exhausting, extremely low-paying jobs because it's cheap labor at the end of the day. And absolutely nobody's stopping them. Until this bad PR hit the stands, that is. Which is why the New York Times ran their expose repeatedly to shine the light on this age-old David and Goliath modern slavery abuse happening right there in the United States. And it was done to call out the nefarious dealings by some of the biggest, most well-loved brands in America, where they described in detail how underage children were propping up the businesses of these giants, sometimes directly, but often through shadowy third-party subcontractor and supply chain arrangements, providing materials and food products to the likes of J.Crew, Fruit of the Loom, Walmart, Target, Ben & Jerry's, Whole Foods, Ford, and General Motors. It goes on. The New York Times article and its sister articles stood out to me as I've covered this very topic of child trafficking in some of my previous blog posts. I wrote last September about the jaw-dropping 25% increase in human trafficking following The Guardian's shocking article uncovering the global statistic that 50 million people were trapped in human slavery or forced labor around the world. In the U.S., the problem is particularly grim reporting because many of these migrant children weren't secreted into the country undetected without identifying them on arrival. Instead, it's the fact that they were acknowledged and they were processed that makes this tragedy all the worse, because these children were then passed from one authority to another, to another, to another, all of whom had some duty of care along the way. I'm talking about the U.S. Border Patrol, the state governments processing these kids, their sponsors, many of whom are not family members, their schools, if they attend, which they're meant to by law, and really the ultimate beneficiary in this chain, the businesses who are totally keen and incentivized, really, to hire these kids illegally under the table. And it's that part of the chain that really props up this whole nightmare for them. It's a system so broken, the Times reports, that over the last 2 years, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, the federal agency responsible for keeping track of these minors and ensuring their sponsors protect them from exploitation, could not reach more than 85,000 children in the United States. 85,000 migrant children have dropped off the radar since 2021. It's a really disturbing thing to think about. So herein lies the center of my podcast today, which is, who is watching the children? I use this question as a metaphor for who is watching the suppliers. But it's a question that gives pause, doesn't it? Because quite a lot of people, grown-ups in charge of important stuff, seem to have failed these kids, which means the failure started in the supply chain. The origins and the motivation for where these children have been failed is really where the money sits, and it's in the supply chain. Of course, there will be good people out there trying to do the right thing, but to have the scale of failure covered in these harrowing articles, which you can read, I've included the links, speaks to systemic failure in many operations. The one I want us to focus on is the corporate angle. I'm talking about the suppliers benefiting from this shadow labor force. I'm talking about the supplier's own third-party supply chain, which seems to be on dodgy ground for the likes of J.Crew, Fruit of the Loom, Walmart, Target, Ben & Jerry's, Whole Foods, Ford, and General Motors, among others named in these articles, who have allowed their supply chains to become corrupted, based on this article, simply because they weren't paying attention. They weren't staying on top of their own supply chain, and they didn't have control down through their downstream third parties' operating practices. So to all my fellow procurement leaders out there, this is our territory. This is on our watch, and we should not look away. Procurement is the last line of defense against this pervasive crime against children. What do I mean here? Well, precisely, what is the responsibility of a company or a major corporation in managing their suppliers, particularly their downstream third-party suppliers? We are going to answer that question. Let's jump in. Okay, firstly, let's break down where the biggest risk is. The biggest risk and exposure area for a company is in their third-party operations. So what's the difference between vendor risk and third-party risk? Vendor risk management is the process of vetting your immediate vendors, those that supply goods or services, where the vetting is typically limited to tactical onboarding, getting them into the system, performing basic credit checks, and in most organizations, the due diligence really starts and stops there. Rightly or wrongly, that's pretty much how it works. Whereas third-party risk management is the full life cycle process of vetting and overall governance on an ongoing basis of all third parties. So this includes your suppliers, your contractors, consultants, your partners, and this is typically managed and measured for compliance on a routine, cyclical basis. Moreover, the responsibility for the governance framework is usually shared in a cross-functional remit across procurement, IT, legal, compliance, operations. And this, unfortunately, is where things tend to go wrong because accountability becomes diluted. If it's not done properly, it becomes diluted, and this stuff just starts to fall through the cracks. Weak third-party risk management, or TPRM, but weak versions of this can be evidenced by the following shortcomings. Number one, linear objectives, which should be monitored, are treated as one-time processes. So these are like credit and risk reporting systems, and not putting your suppliers back through them ever, or doing it really casually rather than on a proactive, controlled basis. Number two, absence of a defined RACI, which you would share with the vendor. So this outlines the accountability standards, such as the responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed roles. So who's responsible for what part of the relationship? And number 3, the absence of functions and resources to monitor the vendor health and performance on a repeat basis. And there are a number of tools, platforms, and reports that will contribute to that, the ongoing operational and performance health from the vendor. So then what does good TPRM look like? Well, these are the big 3 principles of effective TPRM in my experience. Number 1, it's measurable. Number 2, it's repetitive. And number 3, it has senior sponsorship, including linking the board members' bonus and your C-level executives' bonus to their top-tier third-party performance, overall performance, which includes their downstream supply chain. I have a free guidebook that outlines all of this, what good TPRM should look like, the metrics, the reporting, the responsibilities, which I've linked in the show notes. You're very welcome to it. So I won't go through all of this in detail, but I really take a read of it if you're in any sort of commercial or corporate responsibility involving supply chain. I think it may be useful. So rather, I want to spend the rest of the time just talking about your company's leadership as it relates to accountable TPRM. So accountable third-party risk management, especially when it comes to anti-slavery commitments, which are federal law here in the UK and in many, many countries. However, notably, the US is still not on that list for having a federal end-to-end law and protections for minors against slavery and trafficking, at least at the time when I last wrote about this topic. And I'll include links to that original blog so you can see the list of countries that do have national anti-slavery laws. Now, some US states do have protections, and many organizations in the US voluntarily report on their anti-slavery objectives and the steps they take to enforce this, things like having a code of conduct, etc. But what else needs to happen? What can we do right now, literally right now, to try to stop the spread of this unacceptable shadow labor practice? Because, well, these are some well-loved brands, right? Target, Ben & Jerry's, Lucky Charms. These are trusted household names. And I'm sure these companies are full of hardworking, well-meaning adults who have no idea that their company has an unchecked downstream supply chain exploiting children who have so little in life already. So what can we do right now to make a difference? Here are 3 things we can all do right now. Number 1, recognize incrementalism hurts and makes this problem worse. This is probably the first painful home truth I'm going to share here. So what do I mean? I mean, just as we all think that doing our part for, let's say, religiously recycling our cardboard and plastics each week, thinking that that's making a dent in carbon production when it's not, or talking about this amongst ourselves, or tweeting our outraged, these things alone are not enough. And what researchers have found is that this thing called incrementalism actually makes it worse because we're so invested in doing our individual part, it detracts from, and we forget about, the big picture, like holding the most polluting parties in this example, the climate example, holding the most polluting parties, the biggest parties, accountable. In my climate change analogy, we should, of course, continue to recycle, but it's through the collective pressure and efforts of groups of people on other larger accountable groups of people that we can start to see substantive change. That's what I'm talking about here. We need to collectively hold these larger bodies accountable by questioning their practices and demanding open, transparent accountability. So if I was an employee at Target or at Ben & Jerry's, I'd be going to see my chief procurement officer and asking her or him, What the heck is going on in the supply chain? Why are miners working overnight shifts at a dairy farm supplying our ice cream? And as an employee of that company, you may even be a shareholder, you have every right to ask these questions of your employer. It's uncomfortable, to be sure, but we're supposed to be the grown-ups here, right? Aren't we the grown-ups here? I think we can ask these questions in the right way, diplomatically, to show our leaders that we care and we expect a high standard, or at least one that doesn't exploit the vulnerable. Number 2, make sure your procurement supply chain function has a well-documented third-party governance model in place, that it's published on your intranet for all of your employees to see, and that it's accompanied by appropriate policies around supplier code of conduct and anti-slavery measures. I can't emphasize enough how vital it is that your chief executive signs off on this governance model and that they recognize that the proverbial buck stops with them. For most organizations, this will be your CPO, your CFO, some combination of the board, who should put their names on all related process and policy documents, literally on the cover. In smaller businesses, this may be your managing director, your legal counsel, your head of compliance, but the rest of the guidance remains the same. Either way, the point is the sponsorship is paramount in ensuring company-wide support for these measures and acceptable third-party risk reviews are happening. And while we're still on the topic of governance, let's spend a brief moment here to talk about companies like OneTrust, Prevalent, ServiceNow, some really great platform providers, to be fair. I've worked with 2 of those, who have become market leaders in providing effective risk management solutions with some really impressive and powerful monitoring tools, largely, again, based on technology. So I say this somewhat provokingly because the product at the end of the day is only as good as the person using it. So it's not enough for us to, put all of our eggs in one basket and think the platform is going to solve these problems. Remember my podcast last month on faking it, where I talked about corporate hacker Jenny Radcliffe and her crystalline observation that people are the Achilles heel of any company. So it's the people. And it's the people that actually perpetuate systemic or operational weaknesses within that enterprise. So there's 0 point spending a fortune on these great tools if your people can't stand up the right processes, audit controls, and integrity to challenge what's in front of them. So how do companies like Ben & Jerry's, Walmart, and Target miss something so catastrophic to their enterprise as to have child labor in their supply chain? Well, 3 ways. Number 1, by being overly reliant on technology, as we just discussed. Number 2, by failing to overlay clear audit controls on top of the systems and tools. And number 3, by being ambivalent and almost really arrogant that it won't happen on their watch. To give you an example of how widespread weak TPRM is, so how weak third-party risk management is, global market research giant Gartner reported in February this year the results from a survey of global executive risk committee members, where a whopping 84% of respondents said that third-party risk misses, meaning things that crept in through the cracks, resulted in operational disruptions, meaning things were broken, and a staggering 66% of misses of the companies surveyed resulted in adverse financial impact. So the companies lost money in 66% of those cases. Seriously, folks, who's looking after the children? And finally, make sure your supplier contracts have qualified contract terms setting out minimum obligations to do the following. Number 1, commit to an anti-slavery policy. So you can put a 1-pager together. It doesn't need to be long to be effective. You can model this on, state of California has one, the United Kingdom has a good one, but just get something in place that your company can follow. And number 2, commit to the routine, documented assessment of your supplier's downstream supply chain. Number 3, commit to providing monthly or quarterly performance reports, which should cover a number of evidence-based metrics. And number 4, commit to on-site audit inspections of the supplier's operations, including the same audit provision at any downstream third-party site. These are known as flow-down clauses. That number 4 is particularly important, and I think had that been employed properly in some of these companies, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now. These contract obligations will be subject to remedies, including breach for failure to adhere, depending on, what stage you want to enact that breach. For something as serious as finding children working in your supply chain, though, that should be a one strike and you're out type of breach. Why? Well, because it's illegal, in addition to being ethically wrong. And that pretty much brings us to the end. So a bit of a heavy topic for the end of the week, but it's an important one that we stay on top of. And I really hope it stirs enough concern and curiosity in you to go and check out what's happening in your own company's supply chain. A good leader, a confident leader, will welcome the challenge and will want to stand beside you as you scratch that top layer. Hopefully you won't find anything, but somewhere out there are 85,000 children lost in the system. It's my sincere hope they're not stuck in any of these conditions we've been talking about today. Once again, you can grab my free guide on the third-party risk management. It covers these topics like maturity assessments as well, and a lot more to keep us all out of trouble and to do the right thing. If you like my show and you're finding these topics useful, please leave us a review. It's really helpful. And you can join my monthly newsletter from kellyconfidential.com. That's Kelly Confidential with no spaces, where I provide free topics on negotiation and our latest leadership bookshelf reads, along with upcoming course information. Thanks for listening, and have a great weekend when it comes.